This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Tholahungva. The Havasupai tribe, which is located at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, is losing its 30-year battle to prevent uranium mining there. The tribe wanted to keep permanent protection of uranium mining at the canyon mine, but a judge ruled against them late last month. The tribe issued a statement saying they were disheartened to hear that a federal judge has ruled against them, that the judge could not see past the dollar signs, despite the tribe having support from elected officials. The canyon mine is within a designated off-limits area outside of the Grand Canyon Park, but the moratorium for that area, which expires in 2032, does not apply to uranium mining companies that have grandfathered clauses. They can mine in the national park. The Center for Disease Control is denying Native American tribes their health agencies access to vital data. That could potentially widen existing health disparities, according to a Political report. Multiple requests for information on testing and confirmed cases have been denied. Some tribes say states are refusing to strike agreements with them to conduct contact tracing. They say officials have even questioned their legal standing as sovereign entities. The tribal epidemiology centers were created to coordinate public health efforts between the state and federal agencies. Under the Affordable Care Act, the tribal centers are considered public health authorities equivalent to state health departments and federal agencies such as the CDC. In New Mexico, natives account for 60% of coronavirus deaths, yet they make up less than 9% of the population. Tribes have already been hit hard by this pandemic, and denied access to crucial data could have an even more severe impact. The White Mountain Apache tribe in Arizona is turning its ski resort lodge into a COVID-19 quarantine site. The tribe is being hit hard by the coronavirus, and now tribal members who test positive for COVID-19 can stay at the Sunrise Park Resort Hotel. Besides having their own rooms, food and other amenities will be provided by the tribe. Chairwoman Gwendina Lee Gatewood said the resort would, quote, provide our people with another option in a beautiful and safe place to quarantine. Additionally, the tribe is offering COVID-19 relief funds to tribal members, but will withhold payments from anyone who violates any COVID-19 restrictions. The $1,200 direct relief payments will be issued to tribal members 18 years and older, as long as they follow tribal rules. And now for the latest numbers of COVID-19 cases in Indian Country, let's go to Aaliyah Chavez. Aaliyah?
Patty, hello. Today, Friday, June 12th, we have COVID-19 updates from 4 tribes across the country. 1 tribe is reporting their first death. Here are the latest numbers from our database. There are 9,644 positive confirmed cases and 384 deaths in the Indian health system. Again, that is a total of 9,644 positive confirmed cases and 384 deaths as of June 12th. In Arizona, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community had its first death related to COVID-19. The person was a tribal citizen and resided on the Salt River Indian community. Tribal President Martin Javier reminded citizens in a statement that no one is immune from the virus. The tribe has a total of 56 cases and is located near Phoenix. In Mississippi, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians have 31 new cases. That brings their total to 787 cases for the tribe and 45 deaths in total. The Oglala Sioux tribe in South Dakota reported a total of 30 cases within the Pine Ridge Reservation. This is an increase of 28 cases since we last reported the tribe's case count a month ago. The White Mountain Apache tribe in Arizona announced 52 new cases and 1 additional death. They have a total of 1,152 cases and 15 deaths. White Mountain Apache has an infection rate of 7%, now surpassing the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation that spans Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Utah is reporting 103 new cases and 6 additional deaths. This gives the tribe a total of 6,378 cases and 298 deaths.
Okay, Aaliyah Chavez, thank you so much.
Thank you, Patty.
And we'll be right back.
is Indian country today.
Welcome back. Today on our Reporters Roundtable, we have two journalists joining us. Jacqueline Estes is our national correspondent for Indian Country Today. Jacqueline is Tlingit and she's based in Anchorage, where she's following the story about the fishing industry and the influx of people and what that could mean to the small Alaska Native villages there. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
Also on our program today is Nick Martin, and he's Saponi from North Carolina. He's a staff writer at the New Republic, and recently he's been covering the pandemic as well as the public uprisings that we've been seeing nationwide. Welcome, Nick.
Really appreciate you all having me.
The headline that from your most recent article caught my eye, Nick. It was called "Now Do Lincoln." And you write about that protests that are taking place and the people targeting certain statues. Why Abraham Lincoln?
I think it's not so much specifically about Lincoln. I think he's just, for me, it was a figure that has kind of, in some ways, is the ultimate, the representation for many Americans as the ultimate good, right? It's like the idea that this man was wholly good because of his actions, during the Civil War, during this time of great unrest over the institution of slavery in this country. And I think what I tried to do, and especially in that opening paragraphs where I talk about how in North Carolina we have Andrew Jackson Highway that cuts right through the Lumbee tribe's community, I think that what I'm just trying to express is that as much as we hold up some people as heroes, and we being general Americans, it's also worthwhile to look at the erasure we've done of their actions of, colonialism and genocide against Native peoples. And so Lincoln just stood out to me because I feel like, and I've written a couple pieces about him specifically just because I think it's important if, as a society, we're going to progress in any sort of meaningful way. It's really easy to kind of focus on the Columbuses and the Andrew Jacksons, the people that are now starting to collectively be understood as overtly negative and violent forces as it relates to Indigenous history. But I think that the true measure of progress will come when we are able to look at somebody like Abraham Lincoln and acknowledge and feature that portion of his legacy just as much as we feature the good portion. So that's why Lincoln came to mind.
Yes. So, when you ask people to, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe is one of, that's so connected to him. But, what did Honest Abe do when it came to Native Americans?
Right. I mean, you're talking about a president who, and this isn't to say that Lincoln was necessarily any better or worse than any of the kind of 19th century presidents, but it's just to say, I think it is to point out that he wasn't any better on that end. So things that he was overseeing, he was the president during the Sand Creeks Massacre. He was the president during Navajo and Hopi and Apache forced removal. I mean, the things that he was oversaw as the chief executive of this nation line up and are pretty comparable to anything we would say Martin Van Buren or Andrew Jackson did.
Okay, so really understanding this history, and this is the time that I think people are more willing to look at and examine the history of this country and the founding. In Indian country, we hear a lot of people saying you're on stolen land, and that's kind of what this comes back to. The other story that you wrote at the end of May talked about, it was the article titled "The Racist Gatekeepers of American Land." And in that report, you mentioned Christian Cooper and segregation. So tell us who he was and what he did.
Yeah, absolutely. So just I guess to take it through a little bit of, because this is a really complex subject, and just in terms of bringing Christian Cooper into it. So I had to think a little while about how to write that piece because I didn't want to overshadow what I think is a very important movement in the Black Lives Matter movement. But I just wanted to also bring into conversation with that movement the fact that these spaces, these public spaces, that Christian Cooper, who I guess just as a little recap, he was a Black man that was in Central Park that had the police called on him by a white woman, and she specifically said that, there's an African-American man here and he's threatening me and my dog. And so then there became this big conversation over how these kind of spaces have been segregated. And so what I just wanted to point out is, Yeah, many of these, public parks, national parks, beaches, lakefronts, like these have been spaces that have been policed and maintained by and for white people for, a very long time now. But I wanted to just kind of put out a reminder about the fact that, like, a lot of these national parks that we hold dear, their formation was ground in indigenous land theft, and acknowledging that and is step one to, I think, moving towards a larger sense of justice and then eventually repatriation.
And so, and because of the founding and the way they were founded, the numbers of people of color who go to these national parks is quite low compared to white America.
Yeah, that's what I mean, and that's been something was able to dig back into some federal government reports from the 1960s, and they recognized that then, and it still really fundamentally hasn't changed statistically in terms of who visits these lands and who considers these lands theirs to visit. So yeah, that's a trend that has continued well into this century, and I think it's something that I know that High Country News, for instance, has done some really good work around reporting about the different aspects of who's visiting these national parks, and also who looking at the park rangers and who makes up and kind of embodies those forces as well. And yeah, it's just something where it's unfortunate, but I think in order to overturn it, you have to understand the full history of how we came to arrive at this moment.
Well, even the national park system, founded by somebody who was a racist, a white supremacist. Talk a little bit about that, because again, when you go to these parks and you enjoy your time camping and picnicking with your family, to understand how and everyone says, hey, this is really great, we set aside lands like this, but again, who were those founders? And I'm asking specifically about Madison Grant.
Yeah, Madison Grant was a huge conservationist. He's now more well known for his eugenicist and racist beliefs. And you also had a figure in Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt, who I think a lot of people. It's hard for me to take, I guess, a full measure on American, sentiment around Teddy Roosevelt, but it feels like he's still pretty well revered, even though we, I think, at least among indigenous populations, see him also as somebody who was just a continuance of the manifest destiny kind of mindset that undergirded so much of 19th century federal policy towards Indian country. So, these are just, and that's, I think, understanding that these people, and Teddy Roosevelt still has statue. When you go to, I was just talking about this with a coworker yesterday, when you go to the Museum of Natural History in New York City, he's like one of the most prominently featured people in that museum. And that's the case with our national parks too, is we have and are memorializing people who directly stole these lands. And I think land back is obviously has been this kind of slogan that's come out around that. And the first step towards that is educating not just ourselves as Native people, but educating, white people and Black people and Latinx people, all these different people and populations about the history, so that when we go to change it, we can change it from a shared history, not one where people are remembering only certain facets of it.
Sure. Even when you invoke the name Edward Abbey, some people automatically associate him with positive, but he had xenophobic theories.
Yeah, Edward Abbey, he you don't have to look far to kind of uncover what he thought about Native people, what he thought about people in Central and Latin America. He really, he put it out there pretty clearly. I think it's just now that people, or non-white people, are in a position of power within the conservationist movement to say this shouldn't be who we're kind of holding up. But yeah, Edward Abbey's not particularly great on those measures.
Well, so it's just interesting to look at the history of these national parks and the public lands, and again, understanding, who were the tribes that called that home at one time, and where is their input in this discussion today, and especially in this time and going forward. So let me bring in Jocelyn, because Jocelyn, you're working on a story about hunting in national parks. What's changing?
Well, Nick, I really appreciate what you said about Sand Creek, because I had heard about the massacre, but I didn't associate it with President Lincoln. So that was interesting to me. And then speaking of national parks, we have probably, I think half the National Park Service lands are in Alaska. And we had a couple of parks here prior to 1980. And then in 1980, the Congress passed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which put 150 million acres of land under federal ownership in Alaska. So that's national parks and preserves, refuges, and the preserves were created with rules that were unique to Alaska, and they included hunting and fishing. And so ever since now, typically federal lands, hunting and fishing on federal lands is managed by the state. And in Alaska, what happened was ANILCA set down some rules about how hunting and fishing would be managed on federal lands in Alaska. And there was a dispute between the state of Alaska and the federal government about just how that would go down. So under the Obama administration, a rule was issued that said, in part, wolves could not be hunted in their dens with cubs, and bears couldn't be hunted in their dens using a light. And I think it also said that hunters couldn't hunt bears and cubs. So what happened a couple of weeks ago is the National Park Service, under the Trump administration, issued a new rule overturning the ban on those practices. So it applies to national preserves, but I understand that the rule change is going to be extended to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wildlife refuges. So this is a really hot topic, and the idea of going into a bear den with a light and killing a bear that's hibernating is very troubling to a lot of people. So I happened to interview a couple of people who are Athabascan. And actually I interviewed one, and then I listened to the testimony of another, and they are in support of being able to use a light to hunt bears in their dens as a public safety measure. So, after I thought about it for a second, I thought, yeah, if you're crawling into a bear den to kill a bear, it would help a lot. You'd feel a lot safer if you had a light. So I can understand the reasoning behind that.
And are they hunting the bears for food or for sport?
For food. And the man who testified on this, Daryl Vent, talked about the importance of the bear to the Athabascan culture and diet. And they hunt them I was just so impressed with how much he knew about bears and the skill that it takes to hunt a bear. So, and we're talking about black bears here. So he said, Daryl Vent said that they don't hunt grizzly bears. And he described, so this is really different from sport hunting, because we get a lot of people from the lower 48 who come up, and it's a real feather in their cap to hunt and kill a grizzly bear. And as he described it, the Athabascan don't kill grizzlies for the most part. He even described a situation in which a grizzly bear came into the village. And just as an aside, this is something we're seeing a lot more of in the winter, where because of climate change, bears are hibernating for shorter periods of time. And so he described a bear that showed up in winter when you usually feel really safe from bears. So, but he said they don't hunt grizzly bears, they do hunt black bears. And they typically do it only in the fall when, because in the summertime they're eating a lot of salmon, and their diet affects the taste of the meat, and it's kind of fishy. So he said they wait until they've been living off a lot of berries, and the meat loses that fishy taste, and it's, you know, better food. And it's also before the cubs are born, because cubs are born in the late winter, early spring.
Wow, interesting story. So we look forward to that and reading more about that. Give us an update now about the fishing industry that's underway there. We've been following that story for a long time because it impacts villages along the Bering Sea. And of course, the big concern there was the lack of medical facilities and equipment, and small remote villages that now have thousands of people in there fishing, and then, you know, they come back and then they start the canning process. What's the latest on the fishing industry?
Well, you're absolutely right. We've been following this for a while. In March, if you tuned into a Bristol Bay Borough meeting, any kind of a public meeting in some of these in communities, there was a huge outcry calling that for the asking for the fishing season to be called off. And the concern was that, for one thing, I mean, when this discussion first started, we hadn't even had a single COVID case in Alaska. And so what happens during the fishing season is, I think it was like 14,000 people go to Naknek, which is a village of hundreds. And Dillingham is the biggest village in the Bristol Bay area, and their population, I think, is 2,600. So you can imagine 14,000 people descending on these villages, and some of them are just a couple of hundred people. And the concern was that people from, you know, and we could all see the COVID-19 pandemic raging through the lower 48. And everybody anticipated that people would come up here, fishing captains, crews, and fish plant processing workers would come up here, and they would be infected. And people were thinking that there was no way to create a good barrier between the incoming workers and locals. And, you know, foremost in people's minds were the health of elders, who are valued so much in Alaska Native cultures for their knowledge, experience, and especially, you know, one thing that's really important is their knowledge of the language. Since then, communities like Unalaska, Dillingham, Naknek, Cordova, the processing plants have created all these safeguards. And so the, the fears about this have eased. And the barriers are that everybody coming in from out of state will be tested. They'll go into a 14-day quarantine. And especially like in Dillingham, one of the processing plant operators put a fence around their plant. And basically they've said, if we catch you off plant grounds, you're going home. You're losing this job and you're getting home.
Is it okay now there, Jacqueline?
Well, we'll see. But so far there have been some cases showing up, and it hasn't spread from the fleet workers to locals.
Okay, well, Jacqueline Estes, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And Nick, really quickly, what are you working on now?
Now just, I think the next piece, or a piece coming up, will just be one where we look at kind of media coverage around the Navajo Nation in terms of, in light of the pandemic, and how that kind of plays into a larger cyclical nature of coverage in Indian country in general.
All right, very good. Well, we look forward to that report. Nick, Martin, thank you so much for joining us today on our program.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and my thanks to Vincent Schilling for filling in yesterday for myself, and also for Elia Chavez filling in for Jordan Bennett Begay today. And thank you. Have a great weekend, a safe weekend. And remember, Uma umukatsi uqalyani Take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. I'm Patty Tolhungva. We'll see you on Monday.
This is Indian Country Today.